Hello again. Welcome back. I just wanted to mention right off the top, just a note on the first two videos that I posted for this week. I already posted videos on Harlem by Langston Hughes and on Kitchenette Building by Gwendolyn Brooks, our first two poems for this unit on poetry, right? So those videos, I did record them a while ago, and I still use them instead of recording new ones because I think the way that I filmed them with like showing the paper and me writing on them, I think that worked really well, and I think that students like that. But it's very hard to film that. It was difficult for me to, because I don't have a webcam or anything. It's just my laptop, so I had to like balance it and angle it at such a way so I could do that. And I just didn't think it was worth it to try to do that again, just to do a video where I'm gonna say, some pretty similar things. So you might have noticed me say some stuff that was maybe about a different class or some different due dates that don't apply to what we're doing, and maybe also some like really season one COVID references, things that don't really apply anymore. So yeah, ignore that stuff. But I hope that the kind of visual being able to look at the poem, I hope that helped with those, and that's why I wanted to use them again. I generally, try to make all these videos every week as we go through, with maybe a couple of rare exceptions. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that. For the focus of this video, I want to talk about the essay that I had given you for homework, this with the title "Making Civil Rights Harder: Literature, Memory, and the Black Freedom Struggle" by Christopher Metris. Hopefully you read this. This might have been confusing, maybe it was a little bit difficult, but this is also something that I just got off of JSTOR when I was doing research and writing about the kind of poems that we're looking at here. So even though this might have been difficult, this is the kind of stuff that we're going to have to use for research, right? Not just in this class going forward. When you use the databases and we're looking for academic journals and stuff, we need to get used to reading at this level. And maybe just a couple of things that I would, pieces of advice about reading more academic, difficult writing. Number one, I would say don't get too hung up on words that you don't know. Don't feel like you need to understand like literally every single word, or that you need to go look it up or something. For the most part, I think we can just kind of keep it moving, or you can try to just, with the context, just kind of work with it. Unless it's something that keeps getting repeated. I think it's not too big of a deal. So, just focus on getting the kind of larger points that they're making than understanding like every single word. There might be some words you have to look up, but that's what we've got to do, right? We've got to keep growing with this stuff. So this essay deals with some of the larger kind of historical stuff that I was talking about in the video that I did last week. That was just about, a long history of things that I thought it made sense to look at as, civil rights movement involved in that, or adjacent to it at least. So I want to talk about some of that stuff here. And this stuff's going to be important. I know I haven't posted our assignment sheet for this essay yet. I'm going to have that soon. But I think my main suggestion for how to write an essay about these poems is going to be to make an argument about how the poems fit into the political theories of the time period, how the poems that we're reading, where they would fit in like politically within the civil rights movement. And we're going to read stuff by Martin Luther King and by Malcolm X, and some other essays like this that just kind of break down the different strains of thought within the civil rights movement. So for that reason, I do think it's important for us to read a fair amount about the time period so we have some of that background knowledge. All these essays could also be sources, right? If you're thinking about doing research for this essay, all the stuff that I'm giving you could definitely be used as an outside source, and save you some time there maybe. Okay, so the first thing I want to mention here, they talk about the difference, like I alluded to last time, of this conception of a short civil rights movement versus a long civil rights movement, right? And just to repeat myself, the short civil rights movement, and I think they say it in here, is what we normally think of when we talk about this stuff, going from Brown v. Board of Ed to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, this kind of 10 or 15-year period. So this article at the beginning, it presents some criticisms of this way of thinking about it. And I think this is the standard way that we learn about this stuff, right? So I think the criticisms here would apply to so much of the teaching about this time period and the movement. So I just want to read some stuff from the first page, really starting with like the third sentence or so, if you want to follow along. So the author writes, for the most part, the circulation of the history of this time period has resulted in a dominant narrative of the civil rights movement that, distilled from history and memory, twisted by ideology and political contestation, distorts and suppresses as much as it reveals. With Martin Luther King as its defining figure, this dominant narrative chronicles a short civil rights movement that begins with Brown v. Board of Ed, ends with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Following this season of moral clarity comes the collapse brought on by the Vietnam War, etc., etc. According to Hall, this narrative simultaneously elevates and diminishes the movement, for while it ensures the status of the classical phase of the civil rights movement as a triumphal moment in a larger American progress narrative, it also prevents one of the most remarkable mass movements in American history from speaking effectively to the challenges of our time. So I think there's two main criticisms of the short civil rights movement way of thinking about the time period. So the first one that they mention here is that looking at it in that kind of way, where yeah, it's you know from the 50s to the 60s, where Martin Luther King and other people do peaceful protests. America realizes how racist it's always been. They pass some laws and they try to fix it, right? The problems with that kind of story, the criticisms of it here, they say that it shows the civil rights movement as a triumphal moment in a larger American progress narrative. A triumphal moment, so a moment that should be looked at as you know an achievement, right? A celebration, because you know these advances in terms of civil rights were made. So it's something to celebrate. It's a triumph, right? A triumphal moment and a larger American progress narrative. What they mean there by progress narrative, it kind of reminds me of what I was talking about with the history stuff about the last unit with the early 20th century and World War One. But again, this idea that things just always get better, right? The straightforward linear improvement of society, a progress narrative. So I think what they're saying here is that the way the civil rights movement is usually taught allows it to fit in to a historical narrative where America always in the end gets to be the good guy. Even if there's moments where we see America as, you know, the problems of it or doing something bad or whatever. Ultimately, they come around, right? It's a redemption story in a way that, you know, the great, you know, problem of America, the great sin of America was slavery. And then by the civil rights movement, it's the triumphal moment in a progress narrative where America corrects its previous wrongs by you know passing the Voting Rights Act or making segregation illegal and stuff like that. So that's the first criticism, is that basically telling it this way, telling the history of it this way, has the effect of yeah maintaining like the ultimate goodness of the American government, you know. The other criticism that they mention here is that looking at it this way prevents one of the most remarkable mass movements in American history from speaking to the challenges of our time. So that's the other thing, where viewing it as ending in the 60s and coming to a resolution and being definitively over, that thinking about it that way keeps us from looking at how the same things that those activists were going against and the same struggles that they were involved in as viewing things that happen today as part of that same thing, right? And I know I mentioned this last time, but again, why wouldn't we view Black Lives Matter as part of what Martin Luther King was doing, as a modern version of that, or the continuation of that, right? Or, you know, why wouldn't we look at you know, Michael Brown or George Floyd or any of these people killed by the police? Why wouldn't we look at that as a continuation of you know like Emmett Till in the 1950s, right? So that's the other criticism they have here, is that looking at it in the short civil rights movement, framing it in that way, um, keeps us from really seeing from having it speak to the current moment, uh, like the author says there. So going along, another way of putting it, I think they say on the next page, they talk about the short civil rights movement being cast as a satisfying morality tale, right? It's yeah, realizing that America realizing that the things it was doing were wrong and atoning for it and making things better. And just to give one last quote on it, this then and this is maybe the most critical quote that they give on this idea of the short civil rights movement. It says here on page 139, the heroic period of the movement has been strategically appropriated by the state to deliver sanitized images. Um, yeah, so that's probably the harshest criticism, right? That it's been appropriated by the state. Basically, what was something that was radical and that was, anti-establishment, anti-status quo, that was very much against the government. That like they're saying here that the state has appropriated it uh, to deliver sanitized images that basically they've tried to make Martin Luther King a symbol for the goodness of America, right? And the ultimate morality of America. When I don't know, in my own opinion, right, and I think the opinion of our author in this essay, if we look at the facts of the matter, it's hard to see Martin Luther King as showing us America's good. It seems like it more shows us how bad racial opinions in America were. Like if you look at opinion polls that were taken back then, and whatever, maybe the polls weren't as accurate as a long time ago, but most people did not support Martin Luther King. Like the average. I think Martin Luther King talks about this in the essay we're going to read from him. He says the white moderate is the phrase that he uses, and it's clear that the white moderate, like someone who's they're not an insane racist, they're not the KKK member or something, but he says the white moderate is someone who didn't support him. So I feel like today, like today, Martin Luther King's approval rating is very high, right? I think something 80%, 90% of people would acknowledge like, oh yeah, he was fighting for something good. But at the time, it was much lower. It was lower than 50%. I don't know exactly what it is. Maybe I should have looked it up, but it was not very high. Most people did not support what he was doing, even though he was doing it, quote unquote, the right way of advocating nonviolence and sit-ins and boycotts and that kind of stuff. Um, so that's what it was at the time. But basically, what the article is claiming here is that Martin Luther King there's been a conscious effort, not by any singular person, but just kind of in terms of ideology and in terms of like curriculum and stuff in schools, where there's been an attempt to turn Martin Luther King into a symbol for how great America is, rather than a symbol of its biggest failings, right, and biggest problems. So that's some stuff I wanted to get there. Okay, so that's the short civil rights movement, right? That's once again this conception of looking at it as a 10 or 15-year thing where Martin Luther King is the main character and all that stuff. So the idea of the long civil rights movement, of extending the time period that we look at this both forwards and backwards, according to this article, it makes it harder to do these things. And it also lets us understand things that happen today in terms of this movement, right? So it helps with both of the main criticisms that they have. Because yeah, if you look at it as continuing past the 60s, then you can't say, well, we solved the problem, right? Because it's clear that it's still going on. People are still fighting against it and all that kind of stuff. So that's the argument they make for looking at a long civil rights movement rather than a short civil rights movement. I know this is complicated and maybe hard to understand, but I would really encourage you guys to take this perspective when you go to start writing your essays, Like so many student essays that I've read about this stuff, they'll just start off by saying, the civil rights movement took place in the 1950s and 60s. And I just think it's too simple, right? I think that's oversimplified. So I hope that we can have a little more of a critical perspective, kind of take this. All right, so that was one big point I wanted to get into with this essay. Another one has to do with a criticism the author makes um, of Martin Luther King in a book that he wrote called Why We Can't Wait, which we're actually going to read part of that. We're going to read Letter from Birmingham Jail, which was part of that book. Okay, but this has to do with the term that the author uses called emplotment, right? Because he's talking about the sequence of events that King, I guess, wrote kind of a personal history of the summer of what was it? I think it was 1968. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Actually, no, it must have been earlier than that. Whatever year it was, he writes like a personal history of it, right? And what the author's getting into here is the way that King tells the history, right? And the way that he implots it, to use these terms. So before we get into the specifics of this, I think one thing the author is getting at here is this idea that of history as a narrative, as history as a kind of story that people make kind of author-like decisions when they tell the history. I think it's easy to view history as like a hard objective fact, right? Well, this is what happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And these are all observable events that people were there and they saw them, and there's newspapers writing about them, and we can look at it. But I think the point that this article tries to make is that whenever you go about writing the history of something, you have to choose certain events to elevate and others to downplay for the simple reason that you can't include everything because it'd be a million pages. Like so many things happen, if we're talking about history, what gets into the history book, what gets left out? Because if you just simply can't include everything, you have to make kind of editorial decisions about what's going to be the main event, and who are the characters, and these are things. This is more the way that we think about a story or fiction, which we wouldn't look at as the kind of scientific and objective way that we view history. But you could argue against this, but the argument here, he says, emplotment is a term for how historical events are made into a story by the suppression or subordination of certain events and the highlighting of others by characterization, motif repetition, variation of tone and point of view, alternate descriptive passages, and other things. So yeah, to me, I think that's where it's really convincing. Is like if you were going to write a history of 2020, right? If you're going to write a history of since COVID started or something, which events get in there, which ones get out? You can't put every single day, everything that happened, every statement that was made by every single person. There wouldn't be any room, and it would be chaos, right? It'd be chaos, and that's kind of I think how reality actually is. It's a lot more chaotic than a way that we could later explain it to someone because for our words to make sense we have to order them, right? For a history to make sense, if we're writing a history book, for it to make sense we have to put an order on it. We have to impose order onto events that are sometimes extremely random and chaotic, so for the simple fact that you have to pick and choose what you focus on when you write a history book, the author says here that history is always a kind of storytelling, and that's why we can then look at something like the way the story of the civil rights movement gets told, and be critical about it and say, well, it seems like telling it this way with Martin Luther King as the main character, that it was a success, that it ended in 1965. If we look at it that way, then all that it does is kind of serve the status quo and the way things are and the people in power, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so the specifics of the thing with King here. So there's three events that they mention. This is 1963. It's the summer of 1963. There's three events that they're focusing on here that King mentions in his book Why We Can't Wait. One is a series of protests that happened. I think it says like in April and May. There's a bunch of protests. I'm sure these were probably sit-ins and stuff, as well as marches, other things like that. And then there is the second event that they mention is one of the like just worst events of the civil rights movement. Like there's a lot of low points. Obviously, we've all seen the footage of people getting beaten, having dogs sicked on them, and we know about the assassinations and murders that happen connected to it. But one of really just the worst acts of terrorism, I guess, during this time period, is this church bombing that took place in Birmingham. So this is the same summer in 1963. It's yeah, a bombing of this black church where I think four little girls end up being killed. They're the ones who were killed. So it's just this kind of, heartbreaking and terrible story of just these defenseless children being killed for no other reason than that they're black and that they were at a black church. So it's this awful kind of like terrible low point in the movement. So the protests happen, and then as King tells it in his book, the church bombing happens, and then the third event is the March on Washington, which is where King gives the "I Have a Dream" speech. So that's obviously kind of a high point, right? With the kind of soaring rhetoric of the "I Have a Dream" speech, and that's obviously super famous, right? So the way King tells it, it's the protests happen, then there's this awful church bombing, but then there's the March on Washington. And the author of this essay says, well, this allows you to tell a kind of uplifting story, right? A successful story where, like, okay, we started the movement, protests were happening, there's this awful, terrible bombing, but then, we rebounded by doing the March on Washington and this famous speech and fireworks, happy ending, right? The problem with this, as the author points out, is that that's not the order that things actually happened in. So the protests were the first thing, right? But the next thing that came was the March on Washington with the "I Have a Dream" speech. And then after that is this terrible bombing that kills these little girls. So you can see the difference in the kind of narrative arcs, right, of these two different things. King basically changes. So in reality, the most depressing, saddest moment comes at the end of the summer. But King changes it so that the March on Washington comes at the end. So that it's ultimately a story of redemption and perseverance and yeah, a triumphal narrative and yeah, a triumphal moment in a larger American progress narrative, right? Like I said at the beginning. But if we look at it in actuality, where the church bombing comes at the end, well, now it seems like a much more tragic story. You know, it seems like, oh well, there were these good things, the protests, the March on Washington, these kind of positive steps of people, oppressed people trying to fight back and get some power for themselves, but then ends with this kind of backlash and yeah, just awful violence visited upon their community for doing this, right? For protesting and stuff. So that's not as a compelling story, right? And honestly, if we tell it that way, it looks like a failure. If we tell it that way, we can't say, oh well, good work. We did it. We whatever defeated the most important parts of racism. You can't sustain it as a morality tale that makes America look good, right? If we actually tell it this way. So I think that those are really the main things that I wanted to get from the story. It also has here, I don't really want to talk about it too much, but it then goes into analysis of this novel Bombingham, which I have read. It's pretty good. I'm not going to get too much into that, but I did want you guys to read that just so you could see, some literary analysis being done, because that's ultimately what this essay, then kind of like a lot of it is about, looking at a novel and connecting it to these messages that have to do with the history of the time period and stuff, right? So that's a little example there for you from a professional from a journal doing some literary analysis, which is of course what we're trying to do in this class. So yeah, like I said, I think the historical stuff is going to be really important for any essay that we're going to write about this. So keep all of these things in mind, and yeah, we'll be talking about it more going forward. All right, see you later.